Join us now in studio, NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel and former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He's Chief International Analyst for NBC News, has a new opinion piece for Bloomberg titled, NATO Will Likely Survive Trump, but at a cost. Gentlemen, good morning. Great to have you both here. Admiral, let's start with the piece you wrote for Bloomberg. Concern among NATO countries. We heard even this morning President Macron saying internally to other Western European and Eastern European countries, we got to start to look out for ourselves. We can't count on the United States for the security umbrella we've had for generations now. Where do you see this headed under a second Trump administration?
Well, on a scale that runs from the last days of NATO to, hey, the alliance is going to be the centerpiece of foreign policy, I think it'll actually be somewhere in the middle, Willie. And what I mean by that is Team Trump is going to put pressure on the Europeans to increase their defense spending, and they should. Team Trump is also going to demand more support for Ukraine from the Europeans. Even though the Europeans have already given more, I think Team Trump would like to get out of the business of doling out money to Ukraine. Those are going to be the pressure points in the conversation. What I hope is that the Trump administration will see the value of NATO. It's got a big defense budget, second largest in the world. U.S. defense budget largest, collective European is the second largest. And also these are the allies who have stood with us, democracy, liberty, freedom. And third and finally, we are going to need NATO allies, not only in Europe against Russia, but hey, if we want to take down the Houthis in the Red Sea. Oh, what about facing China in the South China Sea? We're going to need allies before this is all over. So I'm hoping that value proposition comes through. But let's face it, Donald Trump has been quite skeptical of NATO.
Yeah, to say the least. He threatened to pull the United States out of NATO. And the difference, perhaps this time, is he'll have people around who might agree with that sentiment. The guardrails will be gone. Richard, Ukraine came up here. You've covered that war very closely for the last couple of years. What is the mood in Kyiv over the last 36 hours?
Dire, bad, depressed. There's a realization that the war, as they've known it, has changed now. I think the war that we've seen for the last 3 years, which has been in different phases, is now entering a brand new phase. So in the first phase of the war, there was this shock that Ukraine was able to defend itself, that Zelensky held, that Kyiv held, and then there was the counteroffensive. Then the last year and a half, 2 years, really, it's been this deadlock, trench warfare along the east, along the south, with minor gains and losses on each side. And that war has been painful. It's been exhausting. It's causing a lot of casualties on both sides, but I've seen them more on the Ukrainian side. And is that phase over? Or is Ukraine now going to be forced to sign some sort of peace deal, which Ukraine hasn't want to do right now because it would be on unfavorable terms? It would mean giving up roughly 20% of the country to Vladimir Putin. That is something that Zelensky doesn't want to do. He said repeatedly he doesn't want to do. He wants to win. And for the last several years, he's been told by President Biden, you're going to win. We're all with you. We will be with you until the bitter end. Victory is what you're going to get. Instead, now I think the realization is settling in that they're not going to get victory. They're going to get an end to the war at some stage in which they have to give up 20%. But then the Ukrainians are asking, okay, we give up 20%. But what's our guarantee that Russia's not going to come back in the next day? They are willing to give up territory if they have NATO, if they have a huge amount of defensive weapons, if they can defend themselves. Otherwise, they say, we've just given up 20%, and then a week later, a year later, 2 years later, Vladimir Putin comes back and takes another 20% or 30% or more.
It's really the Biden administration is going to try to rush as much equipment as they can.
They've been front-loading this.
Continue to. We know that both Trump and his now Vice President-elect Vance, real skeptics about supplying Ukraine any aid at all. Richard, let's shift, though, to the Middle East. Obviously, it is a dominant issue during this campaign. Trump spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday. He, in the past, has suggested to Netanyahu, with whom he has a good relationship,
the whole family has a good relationship.
Right.
Jared Kushner has a good relationship. This is a
very tight net.
Deep, tight.
Basically saying to Netanyahu, you can do whatever you want, giving him a green light. So what do you think? How do you think a Trump administration impacts the Middle East?
We have to look at what Prime Minister Netanyahu has clearly said he wants to do. He wants to take the Abraham Accords. So the Abraham Accords was the centerpiece of Trump's Middle East policy. Jared Kushner was sort of spearheading it, forming this alliance between Israel and several Arab nations. They want to build on that and expand the Abraham Accords potentially to include Saudi Arabia. But Netanyahu has also said he wants to take the Abraham Accords and turn it into the Abraham military alliance against Iran. And he's already doing that to a degree in that he's launched a war against Hamas in Gaza. He's launched a war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. The next logical step would be more intense military action, potentially regime change level action against Iran. And he said that he wants to do this. He gave a speech in front of Congress and got standing ovations on every line from the MAGA crowd, saying we need to have a military alliance. We need to make this Abraham Accord alliance against Iran. So I think he's going to pursue that, and I think he believes that now with President Trump, he can do that. So I would expect some sort of military action, much more pressure, sanction-wise, diplomatic-wise, on Iran under Netanyahu with Trump's blessing, let's say, and support.
Admiral, hopscotching the globe, Janice's report from Beijing was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And we're looking at the most populous nation on earth, one of the most powerful nations on earth. Talk about the South China Sea and the shipping lanes.
Sure.
All the way from the coast of China down to Vietnam and the old Cam Ranh Bay, American base down there. What is happening there when they're building aggressively military islands in the middle of the South China Sea? What is happening in the relationship between China and the United States with regard to that?
Yeah, what a great question. And this is really the big casino at the end of the game here. Middle East is important. What happens in Ukraine and Russia, I think we will end up negotiating. It's that U.S.-China dynamic that I'm watching most closely here. So to put everyone on the same sheet of music, the South China Sea, Mike, as you know, is this vast body of water. It's half the size of the United States. And it is where 40% of the world's shipping crosses. It's full of oil, gas, fisheries, and China claims it in its entirety. And your point, they're building artificial islands all around. In the Navy, we don't call those artificial islands. We call them unsinkable aircraft carriers, because that's how China would use them. So there is a real tension building, and in the middle of it is one of our treaty allies that we don't talk about a lot. That's the Philippines. We have the same security guarantees with the Philippines that we do with every member of NATO. And the Philippines and China are in a real dust-up in the center of the South China Sea about contested waters. So I think it would be a very smart place for the Trump administration to put initial focus. And by the way, if you start with 60% tariffs, you are going to create additional fire in that dynamic. Quite dangerous. Another good reason that we need cool heads as we head into this relationship with China.
Admiral, quickly before we go, I just want to circle back to Ukraine.
Sure.
Do you believe this, as Richard suggests, will end in some kind of a deal?
Yeah.
And is it a deal that Ukraine ultimately should take?
I think it will end in a deal, and whether Team Trump comes in and says we're cutting all aid, go to the bargaining table right now, or they actually give the Ukrainians some runway will matter, Willie. But I think the deal probably looks, I agree with Richard, give up that 20% chunk. And don't forget, that's a part of Ukraine that's got a lot of Russian ethnic support in it already. It's been a battlefield for 2.5 years. The other 80% is what Putin would like to get. It's what we can't give him. If the Ukrainians could get a clear path to NATO membership, I would say take the deal.
They would have to demand that if they're giving up a fifth of their country to the
Absolutely.
Russians.
And there's a historical precedent here, and it's Finland in the late 1930s was invaded by Russia. They gave up 10% of their land. They maintained their independence. Where is Finland today? Just joined NATO.
That's right. Retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis, NBC's Richard Engel. Great conversation, guys. Thanks for being here. Good to see you.